So they're taking their frustration out on that Toyota or whatever it might be.
The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 was about to open an even fiercer battle against labor, a battle that many in labor believe still hasn't let up. It began when 12,000 air traffic controllers at the nation's airports walked out on strike in 1981. Reagan ordered the strikers and their union PATCO back to work. When they didn't return in 48 hours, he fired them. Within months, their union crumbled and the strikers were replaced.
A private employer would be unable to do that because you had to train new controllers. There's no private enterprise that could afford to do that, but our government did it with our tax money.
The result of the PATCO strike shook labor in America about as much as the 1937 Flint sit-down strike had shaken General Motors. It even provoked a similar euphoric reaction from the business world.
What Ronald Reagan said to all the employers across the country with that, with his appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, with his appointments to the courts, was it's okay to battle your unions. It's okay to fight organizing drives tooth and nail. And then as the case law came about during organizing drives, it's okay to break the law during organizing drives for employers. And unions began to be seen, at least in the eyes of employers, as a bad thing and something to be fought.
My view of the significance of PATCO is that it illustrates the degree to which labor had already lost power, and that Reagan's insight, if you will, or that of his advisors, was to say, I can bang on these guys and get away with it because they're not strong enough to be able to do anything in response.
In hindsight, labor watchers say there is another critical element that had a big impact on labor's ability to fight back during PATCO and for years to come. Labor had missed the boat on the importance of thousands of women moving into the workforce, first during World War II and later in the 1970s.
Walter was so good at doing that during World War II, and we all live with Rosie the Riveter and that iconic image to this day, but that was deemed a special situation and a big mistake, I think, that the UAW made at the end of World War II was to really turn a blind eye to the rapidity with which women were forced out of the workplace at the end of World War II.
The companies always retained the exclusive right to hire, and that was their prerogative that we conceded to them. The union did. We represented the people after they got hired in. However, I think we could have done more, probably, in advocating and just raising hell, saying, why don't you hire in some women? And I think probably didn't do an adequate job of that. We were sort of concentrated, you represent people once they're hired, once they belong to the union.
I think we paid the price, because then when the 1980s came and the sort of assault on workers and the right wing and the corporations were emboldened and you had this rise of the anti-union consultant, we didn't have a movement to fall back on. We didn't have allies that we had helped for the last 10 years to come and help us. And so we've been kind of standing on our own ever since.
But it was a failure to grasp the end of the single earner wage family as it was being decimated by these other big picture economic changes in the 50s and into the 60s that bring us to PATCO in 1981. They didn't just miss the cultural significance of it, they missed the economic significance of it.
Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, employers felt increasingly emboldened by what had happened to PATCO. Striking workers found themselves locked out and more drastically replaced altogether. The labor management efforts at unity and partnership that had exemplified a new era in the 1960s and 70s quickly fell away to rancor and bitterness.
We were fiercely resisted in the early days. By every means possible. Violence on the part of the employers, hiring spies, that's part of the labor history. Then we went through a period where we had fairly good relationships into the 60s, 70s, 80s. We had strikes here and there, to be sure, but at least the employers accepted the fact they're going to be a union.
No contract! No peace! What do we want? Contract! When do we want it? Now!
In 1992 and again in 1995, the UAW struck Caterpillar over a variety of issues and effectively came up empty-handed.
The tactics were leftovers from a different reality. The relationship to the members were taken for granted because of the way they had worked for the 30 years before, but weren't working at that particular point.
In July 1995, workers in several unions at Detroit's two big daily newspapers, the News and the Free Press, struck in what became a contentious and sometimes violent fight. Even before the unions took a strike vote, the Detroit newspapers had already begun hiring replacement workers and brought in armed guards equipped with riot gear. Private armies that used police tactics were the new reality.
This strike is not about benefits and wages. This strike is about breaking unions in the USA. And we're going to fight them and fight them and fight them, and we're going to win.
2 years later, after most of their members had been replaced, the unions gave up and called off the strike. But it took 5 years for all issues to be settled.
The Caterpillar and the Detroit newspaper strike are classic examples of unions using tactics that had worked in the past unsuccessfully in a new reality.
And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, Joe sells what they can never kill. Went on to organize, went on to organize. Joe Hill ain't dead, he's destiny. Joe Hill ain't never died.
In Petoskey, Michigan in November 2002, newly organized nurses struck Northern Michigan Hospital after bargaining for a first-time contract failed. The nurses had picked the Teamsters Union to represent them. Half the nursing staff of 450 walked out and were immediately replaced by temporary nurses. 4 years later, the longest nurses' strike in history ended when the Teamsters announced they were withdrawing as the nurses' bargaining agent. A state panel concluded that the hospital had paid a big price financially to keep the union out, and that it had come very close to compromising patient care. But, as happened at Caterpillar and the Detroit newspapers, the hospital management had beaten the union. Clearly, the playing field had radically changed for the labor movement.
It's because of the power of capital to resist traditional union tactics like strikes and hire replacements and get the work done, and therefore depriving unions of their traditional power, which they were slow to realize.
I really believe that the turning point was a controller strike. And then employers saw this as an opportunity to change tactics completely. And what they did is they made elaborate demands on the union negotiation, knowing full well in advance that there's no way the unions could accept it, couldn't get it ratified even if the leadership agreed to it. And so literally forced you into a strike. And then they went into a strike with a battle plan. They hired in advance strike breakers. They did it here in Detroit in newspaper strikes. They did it in many other places. They hired the strike breakers before the negotiations were even concluded. And so there's a deliberate plan. So we really didn't witness that since the early days, since the 30s, 20s and 30s. And now we've revisited those kind of tactics.
Changes we face now are the kinds of changes that you measure by centuries, not by decades and not by years. The rapid conversion of the United States economy from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial economy took a few decades. What we're in the early stages of now, assuming we make it, 500 years from now or 1,000 years from now, people will look back at this as the kind of change from the medieval time, for example, to mercantilism and so on and so forth. So this is a really big deal, and it helps explain I think in part also why unions seem so unable to change, why they're so out of sync, and why their decline of unions has been as rapid as it has been.
The unions gave so much to the American culture, and without which it becomes the them against us, the rich against the poor, where, as one corporate person said, I can pay half of the working class to beat off the other half. Well, we're there now. And it was the angry worker that gave rise to the unions then, and we're angry again at this point.
I feel that unions are both under attack and are questioning their own sense of relevancy. I think that trade unions are going to have to reinvent themselves for the next generation of workers.
Unions have changed in the sense that the strategy of unionism have changed. I'm from the old school where we had to almost make demands, and we no longer can do that. We have to use new strategies. So we have to focus and refocus on the technical changes that are coming.
So trying to sort out how workers, how citizens can protect themselves, how democracy can be expanded and built now is as challenging and as big an opportunity as we've ever faced as a species, as humans, never mind as what industry we work in, what country we live in, even what continent we live on. This is a whole new ballgame.
UOIA. That new ballgame involves unions that are actually doing quite well, those representing workers in government agencies, schools, and universities, and those working in healthcare and daycare workers, janitors, supermarket and discount store employees.
I think that a few unions have the beginnings of a grasp of just how profoundly different these times are, and therefore how the sorts of organizations that workers will find helpful to them need to be different.
Those in the public sector are doing well, and the service sector are doing well, because of considerable growth in the economy in those sectors. The fact of the matter is, actual membership is increasing. The SEIU, AFSCME, State College Municipal Workers, other government unions. But in the manufacturing sector, of course, is dismal. And the fact of the matter is, it's a shocking figure that less than 8% of the private sector are now organized. Now, my guess is in the public sector, it might be 35%.
Face of the labor movement includes not only industrial and transportation and traditional workers that we think about, but a very large and growing number of service workers. And so we have a union like the Service Employees International Union, which has grown from about 550,000 members to 1.8 million members in probably 20-some years. So it's been growing very rapidly. It's very strategic. It's been extraordinarily successful.
Increasingly, unions find themselves facing globalized ownership, which presents another new problem: how to force the boss to bargain when the company is in another country.
Even in the service sector, unions are often dealing with multinational corporations. And so you see a concerted effort on the part of the UAW, the steelworkers, SEIU, to build collaborations with unions in other countries to coordinate their strategies, to be able to leverage their strength against these growing multinational corporations. The steelworkers right now are in merger negotiations with two British unions, which will probably create a combined international union, the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, of 2.5 million members.